I have been on a mission to find the best painting equipment and paints for beginners. As someone who just started their own painting journey maybe 4 months ago at this point, I've gone through a lot of different equipment and a lot of different paints trying to find what works for me. Now, I've reached out to a few companies asking to review their products, and after a few DMs and emails, the Army Painter sent out a huge package with some of their products for me to check out. So this will be the first of 3 videos reviewing a bunch of different products from the Army Painter. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the benefits and merits of their extra large Wargamers Edition wet palette, as well as trying out the Vibrant Greens Triad set of their new Warpaints Fanatic line. We have a lot to cover over the next couple of weeks, so let's get into it.
There is no peace amongst the stars, for in the grim, dark future, there is only war.
Alright, so the Army Painter Extra Large Wargamers Edition wet palette is just that, extra large. It's made out of a quality plastic and it has a couple of layers. The white one in the middle here says Wargamers Edition on the front. This elastic red band holds everything together, and I assume it's because there's no latching mechanism on the top or between the layers. The top comes off, and underneath is the first layer, which is a speed paint and mixing palette. Though obviously the Army Painter intends for you to use their speed paints in this. Underneath this speed paint palette is the area for the wet palette. Like I said before, it's a pretty big wet palette. I'm 6 foot, my hands are pretty big, so you can see it takes up a lot of area. The first thing I'm noticing right away is that these pieces really go in one order. I tried to put the top just on the wet palette itself and it doesn't fit. There's no latching mechanism on it. It only goes on the top speed paint mixing palette. But we'll talk more about that later. So along with the wet palette itself comes 50 hydration sheets, which I feel like is pretty standard with wet palettes nowadays. You also get 2 sheets of hydro foam, which I also feel is pretty standard when you inevitably have to wash one and need to switch them out. So I'm going to go ahead and set up the wet palette so we can test out the Fanatic paints. This hydro foam is pretty thick and it already feels like it's going to be very absorbent. Clear the area and grab some water. And like I said, very absorbent. It definitely takes more water than I would normally use with a hydro sponge. So I'll get it fully wetted and pour off the excess, and we're ready to apply one of the sheets. Now, just like the hydro foam was thicker than I'm used to, this hydro paper is thinner than I would say others are. Which might be a good thing because it laid out immediately flat onto the hydro foam. And we're ready to paint. The Army Painter sent the Vibrant Greens Triads of their Warpaints Fanatic line. We'll be using Rainforest, Electric Lime, and then highlighting up with Vivid Volt and Afterglow. And what we're going to be painting today is a Kroot Carnivore model, one of the free miniatures of the month from Games Workshop. The cool thing about the Warpaints Fanatic line Triad system is that it shows you where the paint you're using is on its tonal spectrum. I'm going to put some of this Rainforest onto the palette. And then we'll mix some of this up and get it on the brush. It's a pretty thin paint, I would say closer to Pro Acryl than maybe Citadel paints. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I want this Kroot model to have a kind of splotchy reptilian skin, so the layers of paint are going to be pretty thin. I thinned the paint down what I thought was a lot, so the coverage I'm getting is pretty impressive. Something to keep in mind when you're using these paints is that you might need to thin them down more than you think for glazes and washes. So this is after one pretty thin layer of the rainforest green. I'm going to go ahead and add a second layer of that same rainforest green all over the body. That second layer is really building on top of the first one, and I always like to test new paints that I get on black prime models to see how the coverage is. Two coats already, and we have a kind of swampy green that I would automatically associate in my mind with Kroot. After a second coat, his skin is starting to look a lot more cohesive. The next color up is the electric lime green, and it actually sits kind of in the middle of this vibrant greens triad. This is going to be the color of our Kroot. This is going to be the mid-tone of the model. Get some of that paint on the brush, and we're going to cover him in a not as thin layer of this electric lime. This layer is really getting rid of any black that's still showing through while leaving that rainforest green in the recesses. And now after that coat, we have a kind of light swampy green Kroot. The color we're going to use for our larger highlights is going to be the Vivid Volt, which is the second highest color in this triad. Take a quick break here to say that the wet palette is doing a great job. The hydro paper is a little thin, but it still isn't over wetting the paints. We'll mix up some of this Vivid Volt. And we're going to hit all of those kind of raised areas, all the places where the muscles stand out on this Kroot. On the thigh muscles, on the knee. And on all the places where his back skin creates some type of fold. His skin now has a base of highlights. Now for the very last and highest highlight, we're going with the Afterglow green that sits at the top of this Vibrant Greens triad. This is really a kind of pale milky green, and I think it's going to look really good on top of the Vivid Volt we just put down. I'm just going to run this on the highest points of each muscle. And any sharp raised points of the body. And our crew's skin is done with a shade, midtone, and highlight. All right, let's talk pros, cons, and final verdict, starting with the wet palette. The first immediate pro to this is the hard plastic mixing tray. It makes the wet palette more universal. There are paints that you wouldn't want to put on a wet palette, speed paints, contrast paints, metallics, and you can put those here. I also like that it comes with some storage so you can keep all the brushes that you use for speed paints or metallics right there. The second most immediate pro is the size of it. Just to contrast the size, this is a Redgrass Games palette that I use as my daily driver. And as I start doing longer and longer painting sessions, that larger workspace is crucial. And now for some of the cons. I do enjoy that it is layered like this, but I do wish it was more modular. It would be great if you could switch which layer was on top and which was on bottom depending on how much you use the wet palette or the mixing palette. The top also has nowhere to go when you take it off. It doesn't really fit on the bottom and it would just make the palette slide around. The hydro paper is also a little thinner than I'm used to, so I definitely put too much water on the wet palette foam at first. Because it's so thin, it lays out nice and flat, so I guess that's the trade-off. So would I recommend the Wargamers Edition wet palette for beginners? Absolutely. I think its size and its universal nature outweigh any gripes I have about its modularity. Wet palettes are definitely going to change the game for you as a beginner. When you're trying to figure out how to thin paints and put paints on the model, that extended working time is really going to help you. And you'll really be able to get your money's worth out of the $4 bottles of paint that you have to buy. Alright, on to the Fanatic paints. Starting off strong with pros, my favorite thing about this is that they come in triads. A lot of people who get into mini painting don't necessarily have an art background. So it says a lot that they're trying to make color theory and tone identification a lot easier for beginners. Another pro is their coverage. Now the outside information of the bottle is all well and good, but they also work really well too. Even with how much I was thinning down my paints in order to build up layers, the coverage on the paint was very good. The paints are super vibrant and I didn't experience any lumpiness or grittiness in the texture of it at all. On the con side, and this is a little bit of the same gripe I have with Pro Acryl paints, but they come out very thin already. I think there's some value in learning how to thin your paints from a consistency that's closer to Citadel's paints, but if anything, this is really just a personal preference. Would I recommend these paints for a beginner? Definitely. They literally take all the guesswork out of shades, midtones, and highlights. And I'm probably going to be picking up some more myself. I want to thank the Army Painter again for sending out these products. I also want to remind everybody that I was not paid by this company. All of my reviews are going to be unbiased. The next video will be reviewing the Army Painter Speed Paint line, and the one after that will be reviewing their airbrush line. Let me know in the comments below if you've used some of these products and what your experience was with them. Make sure to leave a like, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you all in the next one.